And first of all, thank you very much for the organizers of this conference, which so far has been really pleasant and rewarding. I have learned so much about Martin Buber that I couldn't even imagine before. My topic today, as you know, is Ingeborg Bachmann's Malina. Malina was the last book publication of this Austrian author before her premature death in Rome in 1973. Before Malina, which came out in 1971, she had published several collections of poetry, short stories, essays, radio plays, and librettos. The novel Malina was supposed to be a part of a so-called Todesarten cycle, which Bachmann had been writing since the 1960s and which came out only after her death. Malina, the novel Malina, depicts scenes from the life of a female character and first-person narrator who is a writer, and whose situation bears resemblances to that of Bachmann's own, and intertextual references to the works of poets that she knew. In the novel, the focus is on the Ai's relationship with her flatmate Malina and her boyfriend Ivan. The novel also depicts her relationship with her father, who, however, only comes up in the dream or actually in the nightmare scenes. In this paper, I intend to show that Martin Buber's ideas, as formulated in Ich und Du, I and Thou, are helpful for our understanding of Bachmann's description of relations between the I and the male protagonists in the novel. Apart from the father, the characters are introduced in the prologue of the novel, which resembles the list of characters in the drama. Malina is described as a military historian in his 40s who works in Vienna in the museum where he has to do with secret documents. He's a man in his 40s who, after his studies of history and art history, has published one book. Subsequently, he had landed in the job as a civil servant in the hierarchical bureaucracy of Austria. He is successful at these jobs, which allows him to repress his personality and be impersonal. And here's a quotation. Unfortunately, I have these quotations only in German. Malina, alter dem Aussehen nach, unbestimmt war, heute 40 Jahre alt geworden. Verfasser eine Apokryph, das in der Buchladen nicht mehr erhältlich ist und von dem in den späten 50er Jahren einige Exemplare verkauft wurden. Aus Gründen der Tarnung Staatsbeamter der Klasse A, angestellt im österreichischen Heeresmuseum, wo ihm sein abgeschlossenes Studium der Geschichte, Hauptfach und Kunstgeschichte, Nebenfach, ermöglichte, unterzukommen und einen günstigen Platz einzunehmen, auf dem er vorrückt, ohne sich zu bewegen, ohne sich je bemerkbar zu machen. In contrast to this fairly detailed description about Malina, the introduction about the I, the protagonist, female protagonist, gives only little information about her. Apart from formalities and outer features such as her nationality, birthplace, profession, address, and hair, eye color, the introduction shows that information has been wiped out about details concerning her life. Ich, österreichischer Pass, ausgestellt vom Innenministerium, beglaubigter Staatsbürgerschaftsnachweis, Augen braun, Haare blond, geboren in Klagenfurt, es folgen Daten und ein Brief, zweimal durchgestrichen und überschrieben. Adressen dreimal durchgestrichen und in korrekter Schrift ist darüber zu lesen. Wohnhaft Ungargasse 6, Wien 3. Ivan's introduction also gives only little information about his life. It tells that he is not Austrian but comes from Hungary and works in the financial sector. Ivan, geboren 1935 in Ungarn, Pécs, vormals Fünfkirche, lebt seit einigen Jahren in Wien und geht einer geregelten Arbeit nach in einem Gebäude, das am Kärntner Ring liegt. Um keine unnötigen Verwicklungen für Ivan und seine Zukunft heraufzubeschwören, soll es als ein Institut für äußerst notwendige Angelegenheiten bezeichnet werden, da es sich mit Geld befasst. Es ist nicht die Kreditanstalt. In the first part of the novel, the Eye tells about her attempts to form a stable relationship with Ivan. The end of their relationships leaves her into a depressive state, which she hopes to overcome in the discussions with her flatmate, Malina, whom she had known already a long time. As she recalls, her relationship with him had been from the very beginning difficult, as she had always felt to be subordinated to Malina's masculinity. Meine Beziehung zu Malina hat jahrelang aus misslichen Begegnungen, den größten Missverständnissen und einigen dummen Fantasien bestanden. Ich will damit sagen, aus viel größeren Missverständnissen als die zu anderen Menschen. Ich war allerdings von Anfang an unter ihn gestellt und ich muss früh gewusst haben, dass mir zum Verhängnis werden musste, dass Malinas Platz schon vor Malina besetzt war, ehe er sich in meinem Leben eingestellte. In Malina's company, the Eye has a feeling of being ignored by him and of becoming the object of his hostility even. She feels to be considered by Malina as his dark side, like a shadow, and the Eye draws upon the biblical creation story while describing their situation. Mir scheint es dann, dass seine Ruhe davon herrührt, weil ich ein so unwichtiges, unbekanntes Ich für ihn bin, als hätte er mich ausgeschieden, einen Abfall aus seiner Rippe gemacht und ihm seit Jahren entbehrlich, aber auch eine unvermeidliche dunkle Geschichte, die seine Geschichte begleitet, erkennen will, die er aber von seiner klaren Geschichte absondert und abgrenzt. In her discussions with Malina, she hopes to gain emotional support and understanding for her situation. Instead, Malina forces her to rigorous discussions about her life, personality, past, and family, which she can't bear, and his questions only make her feel increasingly defeated. Malina criticizes the most essential parts of her life and personality, including her work, and he even destroys objects that belong to her. In their final discussions, Malina demands that she should give up her own personality in order to come into terms with her life. Was du willst, zählt nicht mehr. An der richtigen Stelle hast du nicht mehr zu wollen. Du wirst dort so sehr du sein, dass du dein Ich aufgeben kannst. Es wird die erste Stelle sein, auf der die Welt von jemandem geheilt ist. It is obvious that the dialogues and communication between the Eye and Malina remain on the level which does not gain what Buber calls Ich-Du relationship, I-Thou. In contrast, in their relationship, Malina considers the Eye as it, as an object, not a person with own integrity, as an object to whom he can project his own feeling of superiority. Due to Malina's distance and hostility, their communication lacks an emotional level, and the inner worlds of the Eye and Malina remain separate. As Stephen Katz has pointed out, Buber's description of Ich, Es, I, It relation should be understood as follows. An I-it relationship is primarily utilitarian. The I observes, calculates, uses, manipulates the it, even if it is another person, for its own benefit, without sympathy or consideration for what is the actual object of consideration or manipulation. The salient feature of such a relationship is the indifference of the active recognizing consciousness to the object to which that consciousness is directed. What is meant is that in such a relationships, the partners do not affect. So they don't have a positive emotional. There's no positive emotional exchange. But also the I's and Ivan's relation doesn't gain a level which Buber would call that of Ich und Du. In the first chapter of the novel, which has a title Glücklich mit Ivan, happy with Ivan, the I tells about her attempt to form a relationship with Ivan. When she is happy with him, she finds herself in balance with herself and not as divided into body and soul. She writes, endlich gehe ich auch in meinem Fleisch herum, mit dem Körper, der mir durch eine Verachtung fremd geworden ist. Ich fühle, wie alles sich findet inwendig, wie die Muskeln sich aus der steten Verkrampfung lösen. But eventually she doesn't find response to her feelings in Ivan, who loves mainly his children. During their relationship, Ivan begins to take distance from her and to make ironical comments about her personality and literary interests. In contrast to the I who entertains a romantic conception of love, Ivan judges everything from a rational point of view. Although the I acknowledges the demands of her own existence, she is not able to take distance from Ivan and falls instead into a traditional female role who tries to please him. This comes up in the scene where she is planning a dinner for him. Ivan darf nur das Ergebnis sehen, dass der Tisch gedeckt ist und die Kerze brennt, und Malina würde sich wundern, dass ich jetzt sogar, achso, da ist das weg. Doch erwartet mich der höchste Preis dafür, weil Ivan schon um 7 Uhr kommt und bis Mitternacht bleibt. Despite her several attempts to come closer to Ivan, also their relationship remains on the level of Ich und Es, I and It. From Ivan's side, there is an intensification of intensity, a greater openness, a more intense opening towards others, which, in Hans Christian Kirsch's words, would be a precondition for Ich-Du relationship according to Buber. The I's traumatic relationship with her father comes up in the second chapter of the novel, which is entitled Der dritte Mann, the third man. The chapter consists of several nightmares which take place in the graveyard, which is meant only for murdered daughters, an isolated prison cell into which the I has been imprisoned by her father. And even in Leo Tolstoy's novel War and Peace, which also depicts her mother's subordination to her husband. The father of the nightmare is not only her biological father, who is violent and sexually abusive towards her, but a negative father figure in the society who acts as an authority in the historical context of the nightmare, which resembles that of Holocaust. In the nightmare, the I, threatened by his father, identifies herself with the Jews during the Holocaust. As Sigrid Weigel has pointed out, Bachmann's elaboration of fear opens up a feminist space in the interpretation of Holocaust. Ich habe den siebrigen Judenmantel an, wie alle anderen. Es ist tiefer Winter. Es kommt immer mehr Schnee auf uns nieder. Und unter dem Schnee stürzen meine Bücherregale ein. Der Schnee begräbt sie langsam, während wir alle auf den Abtransport warten. Beyond these somber narratives about Malina, Ivan, and the father, there is, however, another level in the novel in which the I is able to express herself, and which I would argue open a ich-du, I-thou relationship to Bachmann's novel. Within the chapter about Ivan, there are two separate narratives which express her hopes and desires. The first of these is a romantic legend of Princess Gagarin, which tells about a meeting of a young princess and a stranger. The stranger rescues the princess from the harassment of an old king who reigns in the remote past. The princess falls in love with a stranger who attracts her with his description of a particular form of knowledge, poetical knowledge, which has intertextual references to Paul Celan's poetry. At this point, it should be mentioned that Bachmann had a long relationship with Paul Celan, who knew Buber and had written poems in which this du comes up. Sprich auch du and du sei wie du, for instance. In this final narration of the legend, when the princess and the stranger are about to be separated, she prophesies a timeless and spaceless future when they would meet again. In original, these pieces are in italics. Langsam, ich weiß, wir werden einander wiederfinden. Langsam fing sie an zu erzählen, es wird weiter oben am Fluss sein. Es wird wieder Völkerwanderung sein. Es wird in einem anderen Jahrhundert sein, lass mich raten. Es wird mehr als 20 Jahrhunderte später sein. Sprechen wirst du wie die Menschen, Geliebte. The second narrative that comes up in this chapter entails prophetic visions which all start with the phrase, ein Tag wird kommen, there will be a day, resembling a biblical tone. The present state of the mankind in these narratives is depicted in these as a slavery from which they will rise. In contrast to the state of darkness, in the future world, the mankind will find a liberation from their oppression and gain a redemption in the moment when, as the narrator says, wir werden aufhören zu denken und zu leiden. We will no longer think and no longer suffer. This coming golden era comes into being in the new symbiosis with natural world, which is depicted with the references to the southern hemisphere resembling biblical milieu in the jungle, in the savanna, and with exotic animals. One of these visions explicitly addresses the position of women in this golden era. Ein Tag wird kommen, an dem die Frauen rot-goldene Augen haben, rot-goldenes Haar und die Poesie ihres Geschlechtes wird wiedererschaffen werden. According to Buber, a human being cannot exist alone, but only in relation to three areas: to other human beings, to nature, and to something that he calls geistige Wesenheiten. I would argue that in Bachmann's novel, the two narratives represent such spiritual levels. In contrast to the I's relationship with Malina and Ivan, or father, the legend and the prophetic messages provide her a mental expansion which allows her to form genuine relation with thou. In the fulfillment that the two narratives represent to her, their function comes close to what Buber has described as follows. Die Du-Momente erscheinen in dieser festen und zuträglichen Chronik als wunderliche lyrisch-dramatische Episoden von einem verführenden Zauberwohl, aber gefährlich ins Äußerste reißen. Den erprobten Zusammenhang lockern, mehr Fragen als Zufriedenheit hinterlassen, eben unheimlich und eben unentbehrlich. The eye's disillusionment leads into a mental death when, at the end of the narrative, she symbolically disappears into a crack in the wall of the apartment where she has lived with Malina. Subsequently, Malina, who by this point has taken on increasingly pathological features, no longer acknowledges that she has lived in the flat or even ever existed. This comes up in the telephone discussion with an anonymous person who calls in order to speak with the eye. Malina answers, hier ist keine Frau. Ich sage doch, hier war nie jemand dieses Namens. Es gibt sonst niemand hier. Meine Nummer ist 723144. Mein Name Malina. In this paper, I have analyzed the female protagonist predicament in the context of Martin Buber's ideas as formulated in I and Thou. The protagonist of Bachmann's novels has tried to form genuine relationships with the male characters of the novel who both eventually reject her. Instead of allowing a genuine, immediate communication to come into being in terms of I and Thou, they consider her distantly as an object, as it. And their communication with her collapses into which Buber has entitled I and It. The female protagonist, who doesn't have a name, turns into a subordinated being who eventually disappears from the narrative scene. During her torture, she makes attempts to preserve her spirituality and her mental health by fantasizing a romantic legend and expressing her wishes through prophetic messages about a better future. These narration contribute to the level which the protagonist had wished to find in her communication with Ivan and Malina, but within Bachmann's novel, they remain on the utopian level. Thank you for your attention.